1941. I've been noticing that my videos are getting a little long, so I vowed to keep them short, or the shortest I can, from here on out. See, these Academy Awards are simple. They just, only got, a couple cartoons, and I'm just ranting on, quarter to half an hour on them for some reason. I mean, look, this is surely Ooh. Welcome to the longest Academy Award ceremony for Best Animated Short Subject ever. And what better way to do it, what better time to cover it, than during the Winter Solstice, the shortest day of the year. Without further ado, let's jump right in here. Lend a paw! Walt Disney Strikes Back. Directed by Clyde Geronimi, it sees Mickey Mouse raise a kitten that Pluto saved, only for the mutt to grow incredibly jealous of that kitten when Mickey fancies it. Although Mickey Mouse cartoons have been and will still be present at the Academy Awards from time to time, this is the only time in which the mouse actually won it. And 1941 is not known for that, however. No, 1941 is actually a very infamous year for Disney. Let me tell you. By this point, Walt Disney had released 3 more feature-length animated films in the wake of Snow White's success: Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Dumbo. Although the lattermost was a modest success, and was unique in that it took place during contemporary times, Pinocchio, adapting the story of the same name, and Fantasia, a bunch of operatic pieces set to classical music, including a climax with the sorcerer Mickey, though critical darlings, were not commercial darlings due to the wonky marketing in World War II. As a result, these films did not profit until Walt Disney re-released them after the war. Now, besides that, there was also his relationship with his animators. Walt Disney did not adjust his salaries for the workers in spite of animation becoming a high-paying job following Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He also had a nasty habit of not crediting anybody but himself besides his feature films. If it was a regular short subject, the only person that would be credited was Walt Disney himself, usually. With the rare exception. Many animators began getting angry at Disney, and this all culminated to a boiling point when Art Babbitt, a pivotal figure in the design of Goofy, and eventual evolution of Goofy, in fact, was punished for sympathizing with low-paid workers. Yeah, that's the situation with Disney, because he would pay some animators higher than others. And my, were people mad. The 1941 Disney strike was brief and ultimately successful, but it left a nasty impact. For starters, many Disney animators, both fired and having left on their own terms following the strike, would go to other studios and help them out. The talent boost gave Disney some actual competition besides himself. There's also Walt Disney's reaction to the actual strikers. If he didn't punish them after the strike, then it was either during the strike or sometimes even before the strike when he heard rumors. And this included physical assault, like what happened with Arthur Babbitt. Yeah, Disney physically assaulted Art Babbitt during the strike. And it shows you how even Walt Disney, the godfather of American animation and a generally nice guy, even he had a dark side. Speaking of strikes, the Fleshers had their own nasty strike 4 years prior, and this one was also successful, leading to them to be unionized. But Max Fleischer was a little clever. How clever was he? He moved to Miami. This actually rendered the strike pyrrhic because many of Max Fleischer's and Dave Fleischer's animators did not want to leave their beloved New York home. Besides, they were hoping for some of the top West Coast talent to help out with their new feature film. And besides, this new location that was Florida, met a higher budget in general and tax breaks. You cannot imagine how badly this backfired. Because the several loans Max Fleischer and Dave Fleischer took from Paramount rendered all the tax breaks and financial advantages moot right there. In addition, the cream of the crop in the West Coast refused to come to the studio for some reason, and the few top talent that did were former Fleischer animators that had West Coast experience in their own right. The only notable West Coast talent they actually received there was a bunch of Warner Brothers animators fresh off of Frank Taslin's firing. This combined with the West Coasters' general influence overshadowing the East Coast style that the studio was by this point known for, led to Gulliver's Travels being the most Disney thing the Fleischers ever did, which was unusual because they were supposed to be the antithesis of Disney. The film was a success, but the production was so messy, and the loans that were brought up by Paramount were so big that the studio still struggled. And then there was the dissolution of the Fleischers' relationship. It began when Dave Fleischer was refused the ability to score Gulliver's Travels. Then, both Max and Dave eventually began arguing as Dave wanted more control over Max, and managed to manipulate things so Max barely had any power, culminating in the two accusing each other of cheating on their wives with their secretary. It gave one of the animators, Seymour Neidl, who by this point was Max Fleischer's in-law, that will factor later, the first of many heart attacks he would suffer throughout his long career. Oh, and the Disney-esque stuff was not just Gulliver. Every single thing they did, it seems, besides Popeye, had a strong Disney influence on it, especially the short films that followed up from Gulliver's Travels, starring characters like Gabby the Town Crier. Realizing that things had gone this badly at Paramount, Max Fleischer decided to give Paramount a request that he just knew would break off their contract once and for all. He asked $100,000 to do Superman cartoons. Superman was not the first superhero, but he was the first true superhero. And he had been in comics for 3 years by this point. He debuted in 1938, around the same time the Fleischers left for Miami. But he had not been animated before, despite a radio show and several merchandise. Well, now it was time to fix that. But the only way Max Fleischer would do it was if Paramount gave them $100,000 for every short. He thought that Paramount would give him what he wanted, being fired from the studio. So you can imagine the shock on his and Dave's face when Paramount not only accepted it, but negotiated it down to $50,000. It was half as much money as they proposed, but it was still even more expensive than Disney, and ultimately, the Fleischers could not pass up money like that. And this leads us to second place. Superman, aka The Mad Scientist, the first of 17 Superman cartoons produced by Paramount. Directed by Dave Fleischer, animated mainly by Steve Muffatti and Frank Endres, with a story by Seymour Neidl and Isidore Sparber. with music by Sammy Timber. These films were unique from the competitors for the first time in a while. Because rather than being utterly cutesy or overly gag-driven a la Looney Tunes, these cartoons were action-packed dramas that strove to be as realistic as possible. It also helped establish many things about the Superman mythos, like faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, yada yada yada. The phone booth, X-ray vision, and flight. Fun fact, flight was made because the Fleshers thought that a man leaping tall buildings in a single bound will look awkward. And indeed, the one time they actually tried it, it was as awkward as they thought. Yes, these films were successes, but they were also expensive. So although their success ensured they would continue production when the Fleshers left, they would ultimately only be canceled after 2 years. Why? Not just because they were too expensive, but you have to understand how cartoon profits worked at the time. These cartoons only were able to earn a set amount of money. And the budgets on the Superman cartoons were so expensive to the point where it just couldn't make it up. And all of that isn't getting into the debacle with Mr. Bug Goes to Town. This was the first animated piece of media ever to credit voice actors, and it was the first American piece of animated media that was feature-length that was not based on a pre-existing tale. Learning the lessons from Gulliver's Travels, Mr. Bug Goes to Town was notably lower budget, but production was smoother and more coordinated. Unfortunately, around the time the film was supposed to be released, tragedy struck. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. It was a day that would live in infamy for all of America and get them into World War II. And a day that would especially live in infamy for the Fleshers because it meant Mr. Bug was delayed to early 1942 and given very little promotion by Paramount. Despite even greater reviews than Gulliver's Travels, Mr. Bug Goes to Town was a huge box office bomb. The final nail in the coffin was when Dave Flesher, tired of all this, decided to take a job as the head of Columbia's cartoon department. Since he was now leading a rival cartoon department, that was the straw that broke the camel's back right there. Paramount ended the contract with the Fleshers and fully absorbed their studio and fully bought out the studio. That action right there violated their contract. Now, Max Flesher was pretty much done in the mainstream, besides a few pieces of theatrical animation and eventually TV animation here and there, but he was pretty much done. Dave Flesher wasn't out of the game yet, though. More on that later. Besides, it wasn't actually all gloom and doom for Paramount because, whereas the Fleshers were failing, the Puppet Tunes were succeeding. Puppet Tunes was created in 1932 by a man named George Pal. They are not traditionally animated films, but stop-motion films, meaning their presence here was the first animated piece nominated for Academy Award not to be animated with traditional 2D. They were done with wooden puppets and a lot of camera work. Hence, Puppet Tune. Now, this series was started in 1932, but most Americans probably didn't hear about it until 1939 or 1940 or so, because this series was not American. No, you see, George Pal was born in the Netherlands. When the Nazis took over Holland and the Netherlands in 1938, let me just refresh myself. There we go. George Pal was born in Holland, and when the Nazis took over Holland in 1938, Pal flew to the US and was lucky to get a job there. The ones made prior to his move to the US are very hard to find, and of course, almost all in his native Holland language. Luckily for him, Paramount was able to strike a deal with him and took note of his work and decided reluctantly to distribute his puppet tunes. They were massive successes in America, even more so than Holland, and they are credited with pioneering stop-motion animation. Rhythm in the Ranks, directed by Powell himself in addition to produced by Powell himself, with a score by Bill Edison, featured the simple story of a toy soldier almost losing his job after he falls in love with a girl and gets distracted by her, only to save the day when a crazy army comes and starts taking over everything. Although this will be the last we see of the Fleshers and 2D animation at Paramount for a while, we will get to see some puppet tunes at this Academy Award before things really go to hell for Paramount. But on to fourth place, Truant Officer Donald, directed by Jack King, starring Donald Duck as what else? A truant officer. One who doesn't recognize it's Saturday and tries to get Huey, Dewey, and Louie into school. Jack King had pretty much cemented himself as the top authority on Donald Duck on this point, alongside Dick Lundy. He was one of the few who actually stayed at Disney with no complaints even after the strike. But you can see that he's getting better and better and better. This is actually a favorite. Let's move on to fifth place. Rhapsody and Rivets, a Merry Melodies cartoon produced by Leon Schlesinger, animated mostly by Gil Turner, with a story by Michael Maltese and direction by Isidore Friz Freleng. This Warner Brothers mainstay is often taken for granted because he wasn't really as raunchy as his compatriots. But he made up for it with his timing. A former Disney animator, he was able to time things really well, as were lots of people in the industry, but Friz Freleng was very, very anal retentive about it, and in stories like these, he liked to show it off. It's basically a bunch of construction workers constructing a building to the tune of Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. Now, Friz Freleng worked for Disney from 1929 to about 1930, then went to harmonizing to work for Warner Brothers. He was one of the few to stay on with Warner Brothers following the departure of harmonizing. And as bare bones as his cartoons were, they were enjoyable and was pretty much what the studio needed to stay afloat while they were waiting for Tex Avery to come to the studio. Between 1930 and 1962, the only time Friz Freleng ever left Warner Brothers was a early 1938 to late 1939 stint at MGM, where he was assigned to work on Captain the Kids and was promised higher budgets. In addition to receiving the lowest budgets, the debacles concerning Milk Gross and Harry Hirschfield ultimately convinced him that management was too chaotic and he needed to return to Warner Brothers immediately. He would stay there again until just when the studio was about to close down. We also have a story by Michael Maltese, who had accumulated his first screen credit earlier this year with 1941's The Haunted Mouse by Tex Avery, but he is better known for working with Chuck Jones. More on that much later. The same group behind this short also did the sixth place short, Hiawatha's Rabbit Hunt, which was also Merry Melodies. It was a retelling of the Little Hiawatha myth with Bugs Bunny in it, making this his second appearance overall. It is also notable for being the first of the so-called 12 missing hairs, which were a dozen Bugs Bunny cartoons pulled from Cartoon Network during their June Bugs marathon, which promised to air them all, because the then very new management that replaced Betty Cohen thought they were too politically incorrect. This represented a turning point in Cartoon Network's history that ultimately wound up not being for the better. But that's for way, 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 way later. Speaking of 7th place, speaking of all that, 7th place. Speaking of cartoons they won't show now today, 7th place, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B, one of Walter Lance's cartoons, spelled C-A-R-T-U-N-E rather than C-A-R-T-O-O-N. Directed by Walter Lance himself, featuring a story by Benjamin Bugs Hardaway and Lowell Elliott. Animated by Alex Lovey and Vern Harding, with music by Daryl Cocker. This film is chock full of blackface, but it isn't nearly as bad as Scrub Me Mama with a Boogie Beat. This film, also by Walter Lance, was released earlier this year, and was so utterly offensive in terms of black caricatures and humor, to the point where even people were complaining en masse at the time. The incredible backlash it received upon its reissue in 1948 led Walter Lance to make a conscious effort to not include any serious racial caricatures in his cartoons ever. But I think that the main... And Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B was something that, though it was less offensive than Scrub Me Mama with a Boogie Beat, he would grow to regret because of the blackface. But I think the more important thing about this here is the presence of Ben Hardaway as Storyman. Hardaway was previously known for being a gag writer for Warner Brothers, and was briefly promoted to director from 1934 to 1935. When Friz Freleng left the studio in early 1938, Hardaway was promoted to director again, assisting Cal Dalton, who officially inherited the unit, sometimes letting Cal Howard do it in his stead instead. When Freleng returned in late 1939, Hardaway was demoted back to Storyman, and he was offered to be the head Storyman, which meant he would supervise all film stories. But it meant that he wouldn't be credited with every film. So Hardaway left for Walter Lance, who also made him head Storyman, and did make an agreement he would credit him in all stories. Hardaway, having been the man who invented Bugs Bunny, his nickname was Benjamin Bugs Hardaway after all, of course had that Looney Tunes sense of humor. And thus, Joseph Benjamin Bugs Hardaway would remain at the studio for much of the 40s, helping it stand on its own rather than being a simple Looney Tunes clone. Ironically, his major success story, co-creating Woody Woodpecker, which debuted the same year as Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry, initially was another listless Looney Tunes clone. But that's going to change in a few years. The animators of this cartoon, Alex Lovey and Vern Harding. Lovey I'll actually get to later, but Laverne Harding was one of the few females working in the industry. Her full name was Emily Laverne Harding. She goes by Vern Harding here to hide her gender, because most animators were male at that time, after all. Enough about Lance, let's go to MGM. They too, like Warner Brothers, have 2 entries. The first one I'll be covering is The Night Before Christmas, based partially on a poem on the same name featuring the now fully realized and named Tom and Jerry. An odd little short that actually features Tom and Jerry making a truce at the end in the true spirit of Christmas. The fact that this is their second Academy Award win and the fact that this is their second Academy Award nomination and it's just after 3 shorts shows you how big this cat and mouse duo were. Perhaps it was because Hanna-Barbera actually gave them a distinctive fleshed out personality. Tom was kind of stupid, but he was also very crafty. Jerry, on the other hand, tended to gloat, which sometimes got him in trouble. But they viewed their chase as being normal and were less enemies so much as frenemies. Yeah, they were usually fighting all the time, but they could get along if the situation called for it. As Dog Trouble released next year showcases. Then we move to 9th place, which is also by MGM, and it's The Rookie Bear, a Barney Bear cartoon, the only one to make it to the Academy Awards. Barney Bear was created by Rudy Eising as a way to try and find a star character for the studio that wasn't overly cutesy. Barney Bear was the answer to Donald Duck in that he was constantly unlucky and grouchy. But there were differences. Whereas Donald Duck was hot-tempered, Barney Bear was sleepy and lethargic. He was also kind of stupid. Though these films were successes, they were quickly overshadowed by Tom and Jerry, but they still had a healthy life from 1939 to 1954. It's widely agreed they picked up after Rudy Eising and Harmon and Eising left. Specifically the shorts in the 50s, which were helmed by Dick Lundy. Speaking of Harmon and Eising leaving, yeah, this is where we say goodbye to them. Hugh Harmon and Rudy Eising realized that they didn't adapt to the times well enough. Hugh Harmon left mid-1941 and never actually went mainstream again. Rudy Eising stayed a little longer, and barring a few joints, never went mainstream again himself. And yeah, I feel sorry for them, but this is actually a good thing because it allowed a certain Warner Brothers director to come turn the formerly Disney imitative studio around. That's for next year, though. I mean, next Academy Award ceremony. But for now, let's wrap this up with 10th place. And it does not disappoint. How War Came, part of This Changing World, distributed by Columbia, directed by Paul Fennell. These films were meant to promote U.S. involvement in the war and to encourage it. And it only took 2 cartoons and a bombing in Pearl Harbor to convince them otherwise, rendering what was previously supposed to be a 14-part series moot. This cartoon is very odd compared to the other 9. Because, like Superman, it's drama-heavy and meant to be as realistic as possible. Unlike Superman, it is meant to be really, really, really realistic as possible. There's nothing fantastic about it. It's just saying how Adolf Hitler rise to power and violently took over other countries and that this needs to stop. That's it. It was the first wartime propaganda cartoon to make it to the Academy Awards. In fact, you'll notice that some cartoons on this list, like Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B and the Rookie Bear, also feature the military in a major role. This was considered to be precursors to the more explicitly anti-Nazi stuff that was to follow. And my, oh my, will the next Academy Awards be against the Nazis? Yes, we are entering the wartime era of the golden age of animation. But that's for next year. And wow, yeah, this is long. And I am exhausted. So let me catch my breath and notify you all. This is the Man from Wackyland signing off, notifying you that all that half hour was 1941. Thank God it's over.